There are several fascinating stories of wild men in American history that span across the country. Here are a few notable ones. Arkansas settlers spot monster. Copyright 2012 by Dale Cox, all rights reserved. Last update, July 18, 2012. Exactly what was the Arkansas wild man, a real creature or an elaborate hoax? The truth may never be known. Many believe that stories of Bigfoot, a gigantic hairy man-like creature with huge feet, originated in the Pacific Northwest. This is not precisely correct. Early settlers of the South reported encounters with strange Sasquatch-like monsters long before the first recorded sightings in Washington and Oregon. As they pushed their settlements deep into the woods and their hunts even deeper, the early frontier people of the South often ran up against mysteries that defied explanation. One of the most bizarre involved a series of events surrounding a creature called the Wild Man by newspapers of the 1840s. The earliest known recorded sightings took place in February and March of 1846 in the Crowley's Ridge area of eastern Arkansas. Stories about the creature's appearance were carried in newspapers across the nation, with the Baltimore Sun reporting on March 13, 1846, that his track measures 22 inches, his toes are as long as a common man's fingers, and in height and make, he is double the usual size. Other reports followed, with a second surge of news coverage taking place in 1851. The New Hampshire Patriot and State Gazette reported on May 29th of that year that an expedition was about to leave Memphis to hunt for the Wild Man. The monster was said to be of gigantic size and covered with hair. The same newspaper followed with a page 1 account on June 5th, quoting the Memphis Inquirer as its source for a report that the Wild Man had been seen chasing a herd of cattle. He was of gigantic stature, the body being covered with hair, and the head with long locks that fairly enveloped his neck and shoulders. The Wild Man, after looking at them deliberately for a short time, turned and ran away with great speed, leaping from 12 to 14 feet at a time. The Inquirer account noted that the monster had been seen in St. Francis, Greene, and Poinsett counties for 17 years, a statement that indicates that now lost reports may have been made as early as 1834. Caller David C. Cross and Dr. Sullivan of Memphis were said to be organizing an expedition to search for the creature. This may well have been the first Bigfoot hunt in American history. No written details of the results of their search have yet been found, but certainly could exist. Another round of accounts appeared in the nation's newspapers in 1856. On January 3rd of that year, the Pittsfield Sun reported, "A wild man 7 feet high is stated to be roaming through the Great Mississippi Bottom in Arkansas." Numerous travelers and hunters have asserted that they have seen him, but none have been able to get near enough to give particulars concerning the strange being. Not all accounts, however, were from the swamps of eastern Arkansas. A fairly bizarre report appeared in May of 1856, reporting a sighting in April on the Upper Red River and noting that the creature had also been seen in northern Louisiana. According to this version, which appeared in the Wisconsin Patriot on May 10, 1856, the Wild Man was spotted breaking the ice of a frozen lake. He was covered with hair of a brownish cast and was described as being well-muscled. A party of men from Louisiana had gone into the wilderness on horseback to find the creature and decided to try to capture it. One man from this group had gone ahead of his comrades and decided to try to take the monster on his own. This was a bad idea. So soon, as the Wild Man saw the horse and rider, he rushed frantically toward them, and in an instant dragged the hunter to the ground and tore him in a most dreadful manner, scratching out one of his eyes and injuring the other so much that his comrades despair of the recovery of his sight, and biting large pieces out of his shoulder and various parts of his body. In perhaps the most bizarre part of the story, the Wild Man supposedly made off with the injured man's horse. The hunter's friends set off in pursuit, joined by a party of Choctaw Indians that happened to be in the area. The chase led up into the Ouachita Mountains, then covered in snow from a particularly brutal winter, where the pursuers failed to capture their elusive prey. Stories of a gigantic, hair-covered, man-like creature are told in Arkansas to this day, notably in the Ouachita and Ozark Mountains and in the swamps of the Mississippi and Red Rivers. The famed Boggy Creek monster is just one modern manifestation. The Wild Man of the Winoochee, Washington. Coming from a respected family that homesteaded near the Satsop River in Washington, John Torno was born on September 4, 1880. From the time he was just a small child, he preferred the unexplored wilderness near his home as his playground. As he grew, he spent more time with wild animals than he did with people. When the boy was just 10 years old, his brother Ed killed his beloved dog, and young John retaliated by killing Ed's own dog. It was at this time that Torno began to shun people altogether, vanishing into the woods for weeks at a time. Hunting only for food, he learned to track as well as any Indian, and his shooting skills quickly became legendary. He would return to his home only for brief visits with his parents, usually bearing gifts of game. By the time he reached his teen years, almost any animal would approach him unafraid, and his family had begun to think he was just a little bit crazy. As his brothers entered the logging business, eventually owning their own company, Torno occasionally worked as a logger, but more often continued to maintain his solitary ways in the wilderness. Living off the land, dressing in animal skins and shoes made of bark, John just wanted to be left alone with nature. Standing some 6'4" and weighing in at nearly 250 pounds, most people thought him a little strange but harmless. By the first decade of the 20th century, he was rarely venturing out of the woods, but would occasionally watch the loggers as they were working. On one occasion, he supposedly said to a logger, "I'll kill anyone who comes after me. These are my woods." Convinced he was insane, his brothers captured him and committed him to a sanitarium in 1909. However, the facility, located deep in the heart of Oregon's wilderness, was not able to contain the large man, as some 12 months later he escaped into the forest. Nothing was seen or heard of John for the next year, until he began to occasionally visit his sister, her husband, and their twin sons, John and Will Bauer. He refused to have anything to do with his brothers, never having forgiven them for committing him to the sanitarium. Spied occasionally with tangled hair, a long beard, and ragged clothes, his legend began to grow as people described him as a giant gorilla-like man seen running through the forest. Loggers would tell that he appeared to be a large, hairy beast that would seemingly appear out of nowhere before once again vanishing into the forest. In September 1911, Torno shot and killed a cow grazing in a clearing by his sister's small 2-room cabin on the Olympic Peninsula. While he was dressing out his kill, a bullet whizzed over his head, and dropping his knife, he lifted his rifle and fired 3 times in the direction from where the bullet had originated. When he went into the brush, he found his 2 19-year-old twin nephews lying dead on the ground. As to why John and Will Bauer shot at Torno, it was suggested that the pair thought he was a bear feeding off of one of their herd. However, some historians believe that the boys intentionally made John Torno their target. Though the truth will always remain a mystery, the mountain man no doubt reasoned that someone was trying to capture or kill him when he returned fire. After seeing the dead bodies, Torno quickly fled the scene, disappearing into the deeply forested Winoochee Valley. This incident would become the beginning of a legend that would grow large over the next several years and ultimately result in the death of the solitary mountain man. When the Bauer boys did not return from home, their family contacted Chehalis County. Chehalis County would become Grays Harbor County in 1915. Deputy Sheriff John Mackenzie. Soon, the deputy rounded up a group of more than 50 men to search for the brothers, who soon returned with the 2 dead bodies. Both had been shot in the head and stripped of their weapons. Mackenzie immediately announced that the shooting had to have been committed by John Torno, and a posse was rounded up to search for the wild man living in the forest. In no time, loggers and farmers making up the posse were roaming the Satsop area and the lower regions of the Winoochee Valley, wary of the large man that they knew to have the intuition of an animal and the skills of an Indian. The posse was skittish, terrified of the wild man, and when one group heard a sound in the brush, a shot rang out, killing a cow. Though the men were sure that Torno was nearby each time they heard the slightest noise in the woods, they never spotted him. The longer they searched and didn't find the ape-man killer, the tales grew more and more exaggerated. Soon, the stories told of a cold-eyed giant constantly traversing the forest in search of prey, who soon earned such labels as the Wild Man of the Winoochi, the Cougar Man, and a Mad Daniel Boone. With each telling, the story became larger and larger until the entire countryside was terrified. As the stories spread to the adjacent camps of Aberdeen, Montesano, Elma, and Hoquiam, no one felt safe with John Torno on the prowl. Women and children were warned to stay indoors, as the men oiled their hunting rifles and unleashed their dogs for protection. As men continued to search into the winter, they were forced into the lowlands due to deep snows. Torno simply headed to higher terrain. Sometime later, the wild man broke into Jackson's country grocery store, intending to help himself to a few provisions. Often he was known to burglarize cabins and stores in order to get what he needed to survive. However, on this occasion, he found more than just flour, salt, and matches, but also a strongbox filled with some $15,000. The grocery also served as the town's bank. In no time, Chehalis County offered a $1,000 reward for the return of the stolen money, and despite their fears of the wild man, the number of men hunting Torno dramatically increased. The blasts of gunfire could be heard echoing in the forest, and on February 20th, 1912, a gunshot-happy hunter killed a 17-year-old boy, mistaking him for Torno. A few weeks later, a traveling prospector reported to Sheriff Mackenzie that he had spotted Torno at a camp in Oxbow. Together with Deputy Game Warden Albert V. Elmer, the pair headed out but found only a cold campfire at the point where Torno had been spied. Sure that the money was buried somewhere close, the two began to look around. Though they were rewarded with 2 gold coins, they didn't find the strongbox. Sometime later, both Sheriff Mackenzie and Warden Elmer went missing, and the reward was increased to $2,000. On March 16th, Deputy Sheriff A.L. Fitzgerald gathered up another posse to hunt for the ape-man in both Oxbow and Chehalis counties. Though they searched high and low for Torno, what they found instead were the bodies of Sheriff Mackenzie and Albert Elmer. Both had been shot between the eyes and gutted with a knife. Though the searches continued and Torno was spied here and there, the mountain man continued to elude capture. A month later, on April 16th, Deputy Giles Quimby, along with 2 other men by the names of Louis Blair and Charlie Lathrop, came upon a small shack made of bark. Sure that the crude cabin belonged to Torno, Quimby wanted to head back for a posse, but the other 2 balked at having to share the bounty. So, with guns ready, they approached the shack when a shot rang out, hitting Blair, who fell into the nearby bushes. Lathrop returned fire, but was immediately hit in the neck, killing him instantly. Quimby, left alone with the marksman, desperately tried to negotiate with Torno, telling him that all he wanted was the strongbox and promising to let the wanted man go free. From his hiding place, Torno shouted, "It's buried." Quimby continued to assert that he wanted nothing but the return of the money and would then leave John alone. Though Torno was hesitant, not sure that Quimby would keep his word, the deputy assured him that he would let him go. Finally, Torno answered the deputy by stating, "It's buried in Oxbow, by the boulder that looks like a fish's fin. Take it and leave me alone." Having retrieved the information from Torno, Quimby didn't keep his word, opening fire upon the foliage where John was hiding. Though no return shots were fired, Quimby wasn't sure if he had hit the man or if Torno might be just playing dead. Stealthily, Quimby scurried away through the woods. When Quimby returned to Montesano, Sheriff Matthews gathered up another posse, and the men began the trek back to the spot where Quimby had fired on Torno. After cautiously approaching the trees, Torno was found dead leaning against a tree. The men found $6.65 in silver coins on his body, identifying some of them as those taken from Jackson's grocery store. Before Torno's body was even returned to Montesano, word had already reached the town that the wild man had been killed, and curious gawkers began lining the street in order to get a peek at the legendary mountain man. Deputy Sheriff Giles Quimby told newspaper reporters that John Torno had the most horrible face I ever saw. The shaggy beard and long hair, out of which gleamed two shining, murderous eyes, haunts me now. I could only see his face as he uncovered himself to fire a shot, and all the hatred that could fire the soul of a human being was evident. This further fueled the curiosity seeker's desire to see the wild man's face. In response, his brother Fred, who had traveled up from Portland, tried to prevent the body's public display. However, when some 250 gawkers stormed the tiny morgue demanding to see the body, the overwhelmed coroner allowed them inside. Before it was said and done, the crowd required dozens of deputy sheriffs to prevent the nearly 700 citizens from tearing off bits of the dead man's clothing and removing locks of his hair. Fearing that those who were unable to view the body at the morgue would appear at the funeral, his service was held at the family's old homestead. Immediately, postcards were printed that featured a photo of Torno, along with numerous newspaper articles with screaming headlines calling Torno the great outlaw of Western Washington. Of his brother's death, Fred Torno would, when questioned by the press, say, "I am glad John is dead. It was the best way now that it is over, and I would rather see him killed outright than linger in a prison cell." The Oregonian newspaper noted that at the time of Torno's death, he had $1,700 on deposit in a Montesano bank, owned real estate in Aberdeen, and was a part owner of a timber claim in Chehalis. Giles Quimby was proclaimed a hero for finally killing the feared wild man of the Wynoochee, so much so that he received offers to appear on stage to tell of his gruesome tale. Quimby politely turned down these offers. When the furor of Torno's death had settled, Quimby went looking for the boulder that looked like a fish's fin and was delighted when he found it. However, his happiness was short-lived. Search as he might, he never found the strongbox. Numerous other men followed in his footsteps, looking all over Oxbow, Washington, but the $15,000 treasure was never found. The money is thought to be buried on the Wynoochee River, where it turns into a large, horseshoe-shaped creek. However, a dam has since been built upstream, which may have caused a change in the river's flow. Torno said that he buried the cash near a fin-like rock. The hiding place is within the Olympic National Forest, which requires permission to hunt. Torno was buried in Matlock Cemetery in Grays Harbor, Washington, where his tombstone stands today. In 1877, a party of gold miners traveling through the Globe Valley in Caldwell County, North Carolina, encountered what they described as a wild man. Although they only got within 40 yards of the man, one miner claimed that this peculiar specimen of humanity appeared to be a giant, 6 foot 5 inches, with a funnel-shaped head and 2-inch-long dark hair covering his body. When he spotted the miners, he pounded on his chest before turning and bounding off into the woods with the speed of a deer. The party tracked him with guns drawn to a cave deep in the mountains, where they found bones of many animals scattered about, indicating that he had been living there a while. The most amazing thing about this story is how similar it was to hundreds of other sightings, encounters, and confrontations that supposedly took place across the United States following the Civil War. Newspapers and magazines carried their stories, reprinting those from faraway corners of the nation. They were very strange reports, and remarkably similar. In 1896, Forest and Stream published a sketch of the wild man of Chilhowie, a gruffalo-type creature with talon-like fingernails and toenails, tusks instead of teeth, and hair and beard to his waist. 4 hunters encountered the naked man in the forests of East Tennessee, and after following him back to his lair, they attempted to seize him and haul him back to Cleveland, but the man used his brute strength to overpower the men and run. A posse later returned for the wild man, captured him, and sent him to the insane asylum, where, according to the report, he now reposes in comfort. A group of hikers found a wild man living in wildness and savagery in a crude structure on top of one of Pennsylvania's most remote mountains. When they attempted to communicate with the man, he could only grunt and wave his hands. One white man hauled into a New Jersey town by a hunting party swung through the trees like a monkey with a wild expression in his eyes, but he could only utter the phrase, "Give me some grass." Most newspapers described the wild men in similar terms. They were covered in hair, as fast as a deer, unusually large and hideous. They were not Indians, they were not African Americans. They were often described as white, if their race was described at all, but they did not appear to be human, and if they were a degraded form of humanity. The people that encountered wild men responded with, at best, curiosity, and at worst, vile contempt. They almost always tried to capture him, and occasionally they killed him. The so-called Wild Man of Camas was killed by an axe by a group of emigrants through Idaho in 1883. After having caught wind of the presence of a wild man in northwestern Nevada, a group of citizens led a posse into his camp. Upon seeing the posse, the infuriated demon, a 40-year-old white man, took off running toward the horses, but members of the posse opened fire, chasing him back into the forest. Stories like these abounded. What can explain this flurry of sightings of putative wild men in American woods at the close of the 19th century? The answer, of course, is complicated. It must have spoke to some deep-seated cultural needs of contemporary Americans. The label wild man was heavy with meaning. The wild man myth dates back to antiquity, and people could find specimens of them in countless circuses and traveling freak shows. P.T. Barnum popularized the wild man from Borneo, who had a thick coat of fur and was touted as the missing link between orangutans and humans. Wild men were the subject of popular novels and countless fireside stories. It was truly a national obsession. The label wild man, then, carried with it a set of expectations grounded in popular culture. When a person encountered a figure in the woods that could not be readily explained, his or her imagination filled in the missing details using this cultural reference point. Although it has taken different forms through the last 4 centuries, the wild man myth has remained remarkably durable in the Western mind. He has been cast in dozens of roles, beginning with the descendants of Cain and Ishmael. The Romantic movement transformed him from despised antagonist to a sympathetic and even admired creature. In this form, he played Rousseau's Natural Man, George Catlin's Noble Savage, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan, and Rudyard Kipling's Mowgli. These writers used the wild man to promote a type of masculinity that was raw, virile, and unspoiled by the negative effects of civilization, whether it was materialism, moral depravity, or effeminacy. In short, they were commentaries on the state of culture during an economically and politically transitional time for men. Our wild man of the woods did not elicit sympathy from those who recorded his deeds in pages of newsprint. 19th century Americans insisted on seeing the North American wild man of the woods as a great oddity, beast-like, unintelligent, and ignoble. It wasn't enough for them to say that he lived uninfluenced by civilization. They claimed that he was physically abhorrent, that living in the forest had changed his appearance, that evolution, in effect, had reversed itself. Unlike these famous wild men, the common wild man of the American woods was not born in a state of wildness. He was quite often believed to be a former member of a civilized white community who had either gone insane or was fleeing some conflict involving humanity. In 1871, a wild man was rounded up by a squad of citizens near Morgantown, West Virginia. Described as half man and half beast, covered in rags with long brushy hair, giving him the appearance of a gorilla more than a human being, the putative wild man said his name was Thomas Foley, a native of Ireland. Foley had lived in Connecticut for some years before fleeing for the wilds of West Virginia, where he had been for only 2 years. After one of the squad leaders brought him home and dressed him in nice clothes, he took an opportunity to escape and bolted for the mountains, tearing off his clothes as he ran. The wild man, who supposedly captured 5 members of Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army in Tennessee, was reported to be one Bill Patton, who refused to join the Confederate Army and took to the hills to flee the Home Guard. The wild man of Shattusack Mountain, Vermont, was found to be Thomas Oerman, a Prussian immigrant who had been living off of wild berries, apples, and woodchucks for 5 months. In northeastern Ohio, a wild man who was captured after drifting into town one day looking ragged, tan, and hairy was one John Kinney, once an intelligent and highly educated man. He had been living in the woods for several weeks and was now, according to the Hopkinsville Kentuckian, violently insane. These men had chosen, as adults, to leave society behind and return to the wild. It would shape their public image. By describing men who lived in the woods as hideous monsters, the popularizers of the wild men were reaffirming their commitment to civilization and the expectations of middle-class white masculinity. I think people were intrigued by wild men because, deep down, they had a wild streak in them. But the dictates of an increasingly complex civilization forced them to suppress that streak. According to the emerging cultural norm, middle-class men were supposed to embrace the strenuous life of politics, tedious and unenjoyable work, and civic engagement, while maintaining masculine virility through outdoor recreation, boxing, sports, and the like. They could also choose the simple life, as championed by Charles Wagner, but even that route involved farming a piece of land, not living off the woods. There was no place for wild men in this national culture. By searching for and capturing wild men in the forest, joining the gawkers at circuses, or simply gossiping about the latest captured specimen, middle-class Americans could reinforce their commitment to an emerging national consciousness and set expectations for how people should interact with each other and with nature. The subliminal lesson conveyed by this wild man myth, therefore, is that if a man abandoned his role in society, lived off the bounty of nature, and chose not to improve the land, he would literally devolve into an ape-like creature.